April 30, 1945. Berlin. The Reich Chancellery trembles beneath the weight of Soviet artillery. In the suffocating darkness of the Führer bunker, 16 meters below the garden, the acrid smell of damp concrete mingles with burning paper. Above, the city that once goose-stepped to triumph now burns in its own funeral pyre. But in the war rooms of the collapsing Reich, in shadows across occupied France, in command posts from Norway to Italy, 26 men wearing the highest military distinction of Nazi Germany, the Field Marshal's baton, face a reckoning none of them planned for in their strategic calculations. What happened to these architects of blitzkrieg, these orchestrators of continental conquest, when the swastika banners fell and the eagles were torn from their pedestals? Subscribe now, because the answer reveals a pattern far more complex than simple victor's justice, a pattern that would define Cold War loyalties, challenge post-war morality, and haunt the conscience of nations for generations. The Field Marshal's baton. Crafted from the finest materials, red velvet, golden thread, platinum eagles clutching iron crosses, it represented the apex of Germanic military tradition stretching back to the Holy Roman Empire. To hold it was to stand among Blücher, Moltke, and Hindenburg. Hitler, the former corporal who never forgot his lowly rank, distributed these symbols like propaganda candy, creating 19 field marshals during the war alone. They expected to be remembered as the heirs of Prussian military genius. They could not foresee they would become specimens in history's most controversial trial of military responsibility. When the Third Reich breathed its last breath in the smoking ruins of Europe, 26 field marshals had received their batons. But by war's end, the count had already begun to shrink. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, forced to swallow cyanide in October 1944 for his tangential connection to the July 20 plot. Gunther von Kluge, another suspect, took poison in France. Walther von Reichenau, dead of a stroke in 1942. Wolfram von Richthofen, dying of a brain tumor in 1945. Werner von Blomberg, the first to wear the rank under Hitler, dying in American custody before justice could even reach him. Eduard Dietl, killed in a plane crash in 1944. These men escaped human judgment, but 13 others would face the occupation authorities with their gilded batons stripped away and their uniforms replaced with prison gray. They had convinced themselves of their own mythology. Professional soldiers, they insisted, untainted by the black uniforms of the SS, strategists following the ancient codes of military honor, men who fought for the fatherland, not the Führer. In their minds, they were Clausewitzian practitioners of warfare as politics by other means, and when politics changed, surely the warriors would be treated as warriors always had been, with the respect accorded to honorable opponents. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, architect of the French campaign, commander of the Western Front, expected perhaps a brief interrogation, maybe supervised retirement on his Prussian estate. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, believed his signature on operational orders was merely administrative, the ink of bureaucracy not culpability. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the smiling commander-in-chief South who held Italy against overwhelming odds, thought his defensive brilliance might even earn grudging admiration. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who surrendered at Stalingrad and turned against his former masters, anticipated gratitude for his collaboration. They expected the treatment given to Napoleon's marshals after Waterloo, perhaps exile, perhaps even restoration when passions cooled. They were, after all, professionals. Soldiers. The first shock came in the holding cells at Nuremberg. Not separate accommodations befitting their rank, but common criminals' quarters. Wilhelm Keitel, who once commanded armies numbering in the millions, now commanded only the space of his cot. The man who signed the surrender of France in the same railway car where Germany had been humiliated in 1918, Hitler's perfect revenge, now wore no insignia. When American guards called him by number instead of rank, his Prussian spine stiffened, but the system did not bend. The second shock materialized in the indictment papers. The prosecutors, led by American Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, wielded a new concept: crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and critically, criminal conspiracy. The defense of following orders that had protected military men since the 30 Years' War was being dismantled, brick by brick, argument by argument. The prosecution argued something revolutionary, that planning aggressive war was itself criminal, that the field marshal's strategic brilliance made them not just combatants but criminals of the highest order. Keitel and Alfred Jodl, chief of operations staff, sat in the dock at Nuremberg, the first and most famous trial. Day after day, the prosecution unveiled documents bearing their signatures. Orders implementing the Commando Order directing the summary execution of Allied special forces. The Commissar Order mandating the murder of Soviet political officers. The Nacht-und Nebel decree authorizing the disappearance of resistance members into the night and fog. Keitel's defense crumbled under the weight of his own meticulous record-keeping. The bureaucrat's paper trail became the hangman's evidence. Keitel, who had clicked his heels before Hitler 1,000 times, tried to maintain dignity. "I believed in the Führer," he told the court, as if faith were exculpation. The prosecutors showed him photographs from the Eastern Front, villages burned, bodies stacked like cordwood. These were military necessities, he insisted, his voice weakening. The judges were unmoved. On October 1, 1946, Keitel heard his sentence, death by hanging. Not the soldier's death by firing squad he requested, but a criminal's end. When the trapdoor opened at 1:16 a.m. on October 16, 1946, it closed not just his life but the old aristocratic understanding that rank could shield you from accountability. But Keitel was not alone on that gallows. Beside him stood Jodl, the operational genius, the man who translated Hitler's visions into battlefield reality. Jodl had insisted until the end that he was merely a conduit, a professional transforming political will into military action. The rope disagreed. Yet in the offices of Allied intelligence, a different calculation was already underway. Even as the nooses were being prepared, other field marshals were being evaluated not as war criminals but as assets. The symbolic object that would come to represent this transformation was not a weapon or a medal, but something far more prosaic, a filing cabinet. Specifically, the thousands of filing cabinets containing German military records, strategic assessments, and most critically, intelligence on the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not officially declared in 1946, but the chill was unmistakable. And in that emerging freeze, the Western Allies discovered they possessed something invaluable: field marshals who had fought the Soviets for 4 brutal years. Men who understood Russian tactics, logistics, command structure. Men who had studied the Red Army not from aerial reconnaissance but from killing fields stretching from the Volga to the Vistula. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most brilliant operational commander Germany produced, orchestrator of the Ardennes breakthrough and the recapture of Kharkov, found himself in British custody. The British faced a dilemma. Manstein's forces had committed atrocities on the Eastern Front, mobile killing units operated in his army's rear areas, Jewish populations in Crimea were annihilated while his units provided logistics. Yet his tactical genius was undeniable, his memoirs potentially invaluable. In 1949, he was tried by a British military court, not for strategic planning but for specific war crimes. Convicted on 9 counts, he received 18 years. He served 4. By 1953, he was free, consulting for the West German government on the formation of the Bundeswehr, advising NATO planners on Soviet defensive doctrine. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the Luftwaffe commander who transitioned to ground command, faced British prosecution for the Ardeatine Caves massacre, 335 Italian civilians executed in reprisal for a partisan attack in Rome. The evidence was irrefutable. Kesselring had approved the action. Death sentence, May 1947. Commuted to life imprisonment. Released on health grounds in 1952. By 1953, he was publishing memoirs praising the clean Wehrmacht while minimizing SS atrocities. Western publishers paid handsomely for his recollections. The pattern crystallized: cooperate, minimize, memorialize, rehabilitate. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner, Hitler's last commander-in-chief of the army, appointed in the Führer's final testament, took a different path. Fanatical to the end, he abandoned his troops and fled the Soviet advance. Captured by Americans, he was handed to the Soviets. They sentenced him to 25 years for war crimes. He served 10 in Soviet labor camps, a place where the field marshal's baton meant nothing except kindling. Released in 1955, he returned to a West Germany that had largely moved on, a relic from an era already being sanitized. Paulus, the man who surrendered Stalingrad, became the Soviets' prize exhibit, the first German field marshal ever captured. they expected him to be useful. Initially, he resisted. Then, slowly, the reality of Stalingrad's survivors permeated his consciousness. Of the 91,000 Germans who surrendered with him, only 5,000 would ever see home again. The Soviet camps made Nuremberg's cells look like resort accommodations. Paulus broke, not from torture but from guilt and recognition. He testified against his former comrades at Nuremberg. He broadcast radio appeals for German surrender. He signed documents denouncing Nazism. When he finally returned to East Germany in 1953, he was not a hero but a curiosity, the field marshal who chose survival over honor, truth over loyalty. He lived quietly in Dresden, writing sanitized accounts of Stalingrad that blamed everyone but himself, until his death in 1957. The East Germans gave him a state funeral. It was sparsely attended. Other field marshals in Soviet hands fared worse. Hermann Hoth, the panzer commander, received 15 years. George von Kuckler, who commanded Army Group North during the siege of Leningrad, the 872-day starvation that killed over 1 million civilians, received 20 years from the Soviets after the Americans tried and convicted him. He served until 1955, returning broken and forgotten. The Americans, pragmatic to their core, established the subsequent Nuremberg trials. The High Command trial in 1947-48 put 14 military leaders in the dock, including 3 field marshals, Wilhelm von Lieb, George von Kuckler, and Hermann Hoth. The proceedings lacked the drama of the first Nuremberg trial, but the evidence was equally damning. Orders for collective punishment, authorization of reprisals against civilians, cooperation with SS killing units. Von Lieb received 3 years, time served by 1948. Kuckler got 20, reduced to 12, actually served until 1955. Hoth received 15 years, released in 1954. Why the leniency? The filing cabinets again. And something else, Operation Paperclip's military equivalent. The U.S. Army Historical Division, established in 1946, hired dozens of former Wehrmacht generals and field marshals to write operational histories of the Eastern Front. The Americans wanted every detail. How did the Germans supply armies across the Ukrainian steppes? What were Soviet artillery doctrine's weaknesses? How did Russian combined arms tactics evolve from 1941 to 1945? Field Marshal Erich von Manstein became a primary contributor. So did Heinz Guderian, another panzer genius. So did Franz Halder, former chief of staff. They were paid in dollars and Deutschmarks. They were given offices, secretaries, and respectability. They were, most importantly, given narrative control. The histories they produced emphasized tactical brilliance while minimizing or omitting atrocities. The clean Wehrmacht myth, which would poison German historical consciousness until the 1990s, was not born in beer halls but in American-funded historical offices. By 1955, the Federal Republic of Germany had been rearming for years. The Korean War had accelerated Western calculations. West Germany needed an army, and that army needed experienced commanders. Who better than the field marshals' understudies, the colonels and generals who had survived? But this created a problem: how to reintegrate military leaders when their former commanders were either dead, imprisoned, or tainted. The solution was elegant in its cynicism: declare most of them rehabilitated. Between 1953 and 1958, nearly every surviving field marshal who had been imprisoned by Western powers was released. Their pensions, stripped at war's end, were restored by West German law in 1951. Former field marshals could now receive comfortable pensions calculated on their rank earned serving Hitler. Manstein became the most prominent example. After his release, he became an advisor to the Bundestag on military matters. He consulted with NATO. He published memoirs, Lost Victories, that became international bestsellers. In them, he portrayed the Wehrmacht as professionals hamstrung by Hitler's interference. The Holocaust was mentioned sparingly, always at arm's length, always committed by others. When challenged, he claimed ignorance, despite documentary evidence placing him at meetings where extermination policies were discussed. Western audiences, hungry for anti-Soviet military expertise and weary of dwelling on Nazi crimes, largely accepted his narrative. The filing cabinet had become a library, and the library was rewriting history. If Keitel's paper trail hanged him, paper also saved the others, but a different kind of paper. Intelligence reports, strategic assessments, tactical critiques, order of battle documents, terrain analyses. The massive paper apparatus of German military efficiency became their redemption. Every field marshal who cooperated, who opened his files and his memory to Allied interrogators, bought leniency with information. This was not the food abundance that shocked German POWs in American camps, the endless cigarettes and chocolate that represented democratic plenty. This was information abundance, the recognition that in the emerging conflict with the Soviet Union, knowledge was the currency that mattered most. Field marshals who once commanded panzer armies now commanded historical narratives, and the West paid them well for it. The transformation was complete when the Federal Republic passed laws in the 1950s reinstating the legality of Wehrmacht pensions and declaring that soldiers who fought for Germany, even Hitler's Germany, had served honorably unless individually convicted of specific crimes. Field marshals who had been complicit in operations where millions died could now claim their actions were legitimate acts of war. The legal framework of Nuremberg, which had declared aggressive war itself criminal, was quietly set aside in favor of Cold War expediency. But not all escaped into comfortable retirement. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus died in East German obscurity, remembered in the West as a traitor, in the East as a useful convert, by himself, one imagines, as a man who made impossible choices and lived to regret all of them. His Soviet captivity had stripped away not just his rank but his illusions. He had seen what the Eastern Front really meant, not from headquarters but from camps where former subordinates blamed him for their suffering. Ferdinand Schorner, the last field marshal appointed by Hitler, returned from Soviet imprisonment in 1955 to face West German prosecution for executing deserters in the war's final weeks. He was convicted in 1957 and sentenced to 4.5 years. Released in 1960, he lived until 1973, giving no interviews, publishing no memoirs, dwelling in silence that might have been shame or merely exhaustion. Maximilian von Wakes, commander of Army Group B during the Stalingrad campaign and later Army Group F in Yugoslavia, escaped prosecution despite evidence of reprisal orders in the Balkans. Deemed too ill to stand trial, he lived quietly in Bavaria until his death in 1954. The evidence against him remained in filing cabinets, unexamined, as the Allies decided Yugoslav partisan warfare was too complicated to adjudicate and Wakes too militarily insignificant to bother with. By 1960, of the 13 field marshals who had survived the war and faced judgment, only 2 had been executed. Most of the rest had served less than a decade, many far less. Some had been paid for their expertise. All but a few received restored pensions. The message to history was clear and troubling: military genius, when aligned with Western interests, could balance the scales against complicity in genocide. The transformation was not just individual but civilizational. The field marshals who planned campaigns that killed millions, who signed orders that enabled atrocities, who commanded forces that devastated a continent, they became consultants, historians, pensioners. They were not forgiven, exactly. They were contextualized, pragmatized, usefulized. Their crimes were filed under Eastern Front and wartime conditions, categories that would grow increasingly abstract as the Cold War intensified. The symbolic filing cabinet, that repository of German military knowledge, became the instrument of their absolution. Information, the democracies decided, was more valuable than justice. The abundance was not of food or material goods but of expedient forgetting, of strategic amnesia, of calculated moral compromise. Today, in the Bundeswehr's archives, in NATO's historical offices, in the U.S. Army's military history collections, the operational studies written by field marshals and their subordinates remain. Manstein's analysis of mobile defense. Kesselring's insights into combined arms warfare. Jodel's last memorandum before his execution, analyzing where Germany's strategy failed. These documents are still consulted, still cited, still taught. And in that continued relevance lies the deepest irony: the field marshals achieved a kind of immortality they never anticipated. Not as conquerors, but as teachers. Not as heroes of the Reich, but as case studies in operational art. Their batons are museum pieces, their uniforms curiosities. But their ideas, sanitized, contextualized, stripped of ideology, march on through the curricula of military academies across the West. What happened to Germany's field marshals after World War II? They were judged, some harshly, most leniently. They were imprisoned, then released. They were condemned, then consulted. They were executed, then exonerated. They were forgotten, then remembered. But perhaps the truest answer is this: they were transformed from symbols of Nazi conquest into commodities of Cold War necessity. And in that transformation, the victors revealed something uncomfortable about themselves, that justice, like war, remains politics by other means. That principles bend when strategic interests apply sufficient pressure. That the filing cabinet, symbol of bureaucratic order and information power, proved mightier than the gallows, more enduring than moral certainty. The field marshals expected to be treated as honorable warriors. They were treated as assets, liabilities, bargaining chips, and finally, history. Some deserved worse than they received. None deserve to be forgotten, for in their fates we see not just the judgment of individuals but the complex, compromised, deeply human process by which nations decide what to remember and what to forgive when the guns fall silent and new threats emerge from the ashes of the old. April 30, 1945, the day it all ended for the Reich. But for its field marshals, it was not an ending but a transformation, from the certainty of military rank to the ambiguity of historical judgment, from the clarity of the battlefield to the fog of moral accounting. And in that fog, they found what they never expected: not honor, not disgrace, but usefulness. And usefulness, in the end, proved to be a kind of survival.